A homeless girl calls the vampire king, saying his daughter needs urgent help on the street. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. In a dark alleyway, far from the glittering lights of the city's luxurious districts, a homeless girl named Emily lived in the shadows. Her hair was tangled, and her clothes, worn thin from the harsh weather, barely kept her warm. Emily had lived on the streets for years, moving from one cold corner to another, struggling to survive each day. Her only solace was the quiet moments she spent watching the stars, thinking about the life she could have had if fate had been kinder. One cold evening, as she made her way down an abandoned street, she stumbled upon a scene that would change her life forever. In the distance, a figure was huddled on the pavement, trembling, as a cold wind swept through the city. It was a young girl, no more than 6 years old, curled up in a ball, her face pale and her body shivering uncontrollably. The girl's clothes were ragged, and her hands were bruised, as if she had been through some kind of ordeal. Emily's heart sank as she approached the child. She knelt beside her, gently lifting her into her arms. The girl's eyes fluttered open, and she whispered something that made Emily's blood run cold. "Help me. They're going to hurt me." Emily's mind raced. Who would hurt a child like this? She knew she had to act quickly. As she held the girl in her arms, she looked around, trying to find a way to help. Then, a thought crossed her mind. The rumors she had heard. The stories about the mysterious vampire king, a powerful figure who ruled over the city's dark underworld. Could it be possible that this little girl was connected to him? Emily had nothing left to lose. In desperation, she fumbled through her pockets, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. It was an old number, a number she had heard mentioned in hushed whispers. She knew that calling this number might be the only chance to save the girl. With shaking hands, she dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice, and then a deep, commanding voice answered. "Who is this?" the voice demanded. "I need help," Emily said, her voice trembling. "A girl, she's in danger. She needs help now." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then the voice spoke again, this time with more urgency. "Tell me where you are. I'm coming." Emily's heart raced as she realized that she had just contacted the vampire king himself. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, her life would never be the same. The silence in the alley was deafening as she waited, holding the little girl close. She could only hope that the vampire king would arrive in time to save her, and that he would have the answers to the questions that had been haunting her for so long. I could hear the distant sound of the city's streets, the honking of cars, and the muffled chatter of pedestrians as I waited in the alley with the small girl in my arms. The air was thick with tension, the kind that comes when you're about to face something unknown and terrifying. I tried to comfort the girl, but she shivered uncontrollably in my arms, her fragile body trembling from more than just the cold. It was clear she was running from something or someone. I whispered to her softly, trying to ease her fear, but she barely responded. Her wide, frightened eyes were locked on the shadows surrounding us, as if expecting danger to come out from every corner. And then, just when I thought the situation couldn't get any worse, I heard it. A soft but unmistakable sound. Footsteps. They echoed down the alley, growing louder by the second. I instinctively tightened my grip on the girl, my heart racing as the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. From the corner of my eye, I saw a figure emerge from the darkness. Tall, imposing, with a presence that could not be ignored. It was him, the vampire king. I had never met him, never even seen him in person, but I knew it was him. The stories, the rumors, they all matched the man standing in front of me now. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, his expression unreadable as he looked down at the girl I was holding. "You called for me," he said, his voice deep and commanding, sending a shiver through my entire body. I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. "She's in danger. She needs your help." The vampire king's gaze shifted from the girl to me, his eyes cold, assessing. "You know who she is?" he asked, his tone hardening. I didn't answer right away. I didn't even know what I was supposed to say. How could I explain that this girl, this child, had just appeared out of nowhere, and that I had no idea what kind of danger she was truly in. But then, to my surprise, the girl spoke, her voice weak but clear. He's my father," she said, looking up at the Vampire King with tears in her eyes. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything was still. I could see the shift in the Vampire King's demeanor. His expression softened, just a little, as he kneeled down in front of the girl. "My daughter," he whispered under his breath. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something close to fear, but also something deeper. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice quiet now, almost like a man trying to contain his own emotions. The girl looked at him with a mix of exhaustion and pain. "I was taken," she said simply. "They wanted me to tell them where you were, but I didn't. They hurt me." She trailed off, as though the memory of whatever had happened to her was too painful to put into words. The Vampire King's eyes narrowed, and I could see the fury building within him. This wasn't just any child. This was his daughter, and someone had dared to harm her. His voice, when it came, was low and filled with danger. "Tell me everything," he demanded. The girl looked at him, her gaze steady despite the pain she had endured. "They're coming for you. They want to destroy you, father," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The weight of her words seemed to hang in the air, thick with the promise of danger. The Vampire King stood up, his posture now rigid with authority. He turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine. "You've done well," he said, his voice softer now, though still carrying the weight of his power. "But this is far from over. There are things you don't understand. Things you need to know." I felt a knot form in my stomach, the fear creeping up again. I had no idea what I had gotten myself into, but there was no turning back now. The Vampire King extended a hand to me, his eyes never leaving mine. "Come with me," he said. "I'll protect you, and I'll protect her. But there's a war coming, and we all need to be prepared." The girl looked at me with wide, trusting eyes, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope. Whatever danger lay ahead, whatever darkness we would have to face, we would face it together. I followed the Vampire King into the shadows, my heart pounding as the world around me seemed to fade away. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the corridor, the walls lined with ancient stone that felt as if they held secrets long forgotten. The girl, still in his arms, clung to him like she was the only thing anchoring him to this world. His cold gaze swept over the darkened halls, his eyes sharp, alert, as though every inch of this place was both home and enemy. I could feel the weight of his power in the air, pressing down on me, and I knew then that there was so much more to this world than I could have ever imagined. As we walked, the Vampire King didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to command silence, to make everything else in the world feel insignificant. I kept my distance, not sure if I should speak or just follow quietly. But the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like a moment before a storm, the calm before the chaos. We reached a large door, the wood dark and carved with symbols I couldn't understand. The Vampire King paused in front of it, his hand resting on the handle. He turned to me then, his expression unreadable. "Stay close," he said, his voice low and steady. "And whatever happens, don't move. Don't make a sound." I nodded, my stomach tight with uncertainty. He opened the door, and we stepped into a vast room. It was lit by torches, their flames flickering in the silence. At the far end of the room was a large throne, dark and imposing. A figure was seated there, watching us with eyes that gleamed like molten silver. The Vampire King's eyes narrowed, his posture straightening as he approached the throne. The figure on the throne was a man, or at least, he looked human. His features were sharp, like a blade, his skin pale, his hair long and dark. He was dressed in a cloak of deep crimson, the fabric flowing around him like liquid fire. His gaze locked onto the Vampire King, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Finally, the man on the throne spoke, his voice cold and smooth, like velvet over steel. "You've come," he said, his words carrying an edge. I didn't expect it to be this soon. The Vampire King's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with a cold fury. "You know why I'm here," he said, his tone hard. "Where is she?" The man on the throne smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "She's right here," he said, as if the words were nothing more than a casual statement. I glanced around the room, my heart racing. I didn't know what was going on, but I could feel the danger in the air. Something was happening, something big, and I was caught in the middle of it. The girl in the Vampire King's arms stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She whispered something, so softly I could barely hear it, but the Vampire King's eyes snapped to her immediately. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice sharp. The girl's voice was barely a whisper, but the words cut through the air like a blade. "They're coming for you. They'll destroy everything." Her words hung in the room, heavy with meaning. The man on the throne didn't move, but his smile widened. "You think you can stop them?" he asked, amusement dancing in his eyes. The Vampire King's gaze hardened. "I don't think," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know." The air seemed to crackle with tension, and I could feel the weight of it on my shoulders. The room was heavy with the promise of something dark, something that neither the Vampire King nor the man on the throne were willing to speak aloud. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, the Vampire King stepped forward, placing the girl gently on the ground. His gaze never left the man on the throne as he moved. "You have no idea what you've done," the Vampire King said, his voice filled with quiet rage. The man on the throne leaned forward, his smile still in place. "Oh, but I do. I've been waiting for this moment for a long time." With a flick of his wrist, the room seemed to shift, the shadows deepening as a chill ran through the air. I didn't know what was happening, but I could feel it, the calm before the storm was over. The battle was about to begin. I stood frozen, the weight of the Vampire King's presence pressing on me like a heavy fog. The man on the throne, his smile never wavering, watched us with dark amusement. It was clear now that this wasn't just a confrontation, it was a trap set in motion by someone with deep knowledge of the Vampire King's past, his weaknesses, and his deepest fears. The air in the room grew colder, the flickering torchlight casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally. I could feel the tension crackling like static, and I had the distinct feeling that things were about to spiral into chaos. "You think you can challenge me in my own domain?" The Vampire King's voice echoed through the room, low and filled with a deadly calm. The man on the throne raised an eyebrow, his amusement growing. "Challenge you? No. I'm here to remind you of something you've long forgotten." The Vampire King's eyes narrowed dangerously. "And what would that be?" The man's smile widened, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That you're not invincible. Not anymore." With a swift motion, the man snapped his fingers, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to gather, swirling like a dark storm about to burst. The Vampire King didn't flinch. Instead, he stood tall, unwavering, a pillar of unshakable power. "I've made mistakes," he said quietly, his voice almost imperceptible to the human ear. "But I won't make them again." The man on the throne chuckled, the sound dark and mocking. "Is that so? Let's see how well you stand when I'm finished." He snapped his fingers again, and suddenly, the room was filled with the sound of movement, fast, sharp, and relentless. Figures appeared from the shadows, surrounding us, their eyes glowing with a cold, inhuman light. The Vampire King stepped forward, his eyes burning with fury. "Get ready," he muttered, and in that instant, the battle began. The figures, creatures, demons, whatever they were, charged at us with terrifying speed. They moved like shadows, almost impossible to track, their movements a blur of speed and precision. The Vampire King wasted no time. With a single, fluid motion, he raised his hand, and the air around him seemed to crackle with energy. A wave of dark power erupted from him, crashing into the advancing figures and sending them flying backward with an explosion of energy. But there were too many of them. For every one that fell, two more took its place. The man on the throne laughed, his voice echoing through the chaos. "You're outnumbered, Vampire King. The time for your reign has passed." The Vampire King growled, his eyes flashing with unrelenting rage. "It's never over." He moved with inhuman speed, his hands slicing through the air, creating ripples of energy that tore through the figures like they were nothing more than paper. But as the battle raged on, I began to realize that this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for something deeper. The Vampire King wasn't just protecting his daughter, or me, or even his throne. He was fighting for his very existence, for the truth of who he was. The girl in his arms stirred, her body still weak from the ordeal, but her eyes were wide, watching the battle unfold with a mix of awe and fear. I could sense her fear, but also something else, something like hope. This wasn't just her father fighting for her. It was a reminder that no matter how powerful an enemy seemed, there was always a way to fight back. As the battle intensified, I found myself caught between two forces, one of pure, overwhelming power, and the other of cold, calculated malice. The air was thick with energy, every strike, sending shockwaves through the room. The man on the throne moved again, this time raising his hand to unleash a blast of energy directly at the Vampire King. It was a move so powerful that even the Vampire King faltered for a split second. But that was all it took. The Vampire King roared, his body glowing with an intensity that matched the force of the attack. He raised his hand, and the energy around him shifted, becoming a barrier that absorbed the blast. The man on the throne's eyes widened in shock. "Impossible," he hissed, his voice suddenly filled with uncertainty. "You can't." But the Vampire King was already moving, faster than ever, his eyes locked onto the man who had dared to challenge him. With one final surge of energy, the Vampire King slammed his fist into the man's chest, sending him flying back into the throne with a deafening crash. The room fell silent. The battle was over. The man on the throne lay motionless, his once powerful figure crumpled and broken. The Vampire King stood over him, breathing heavily but unbroken. His daughter slowly moved to his side, looking up at him with eyes full of awe and gratitude. I took a step forward, my heart still racing from the intensity of the battle. The Vampire King turned to me, his expression softening for the first time since we'd entered the room. "You were right," he said, his voice quieter now. "I'll protect you, both of you." And in that moment, I knew that despite the darkness that surrounded us, we had a chance to survive, to rebuild, and to fight whatever came next together. I stood there, my heart still racing from the intensity of the battle. The Vampire King, victorious but still radiating an aura of power, turned away from the fallen figure of his enemy. His eyes, once filled with rage, had softened into something more contemplative. His daughter, the girl I had tried to protect, was standing next to him, her small hand gripping his arm. She looked at him with a mix of admiration and trust, her expression filled with the hope that had been missing from her life. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on us. We had survived, but the fight was far from over. There was a deeper threat lurking in the shadows, something far more dangerous than we had anticipated. The man who had tried to challenge the Vampire King was only a part of a larger scheme, a game being played by forces we barely understood. The room, which had once been filled with the crackle of dark energy, was now eerily silent. The Vampire King turned to face us, his voice calm but firm. "This is not over," he said. "They will come for us again, and next time, they will be more prepared." His words were like a cold wind cutting through the warmth of the room, reminding us of the danger that still loomed. "We need to prepare," he continued, his gaze moving from his daughter to me. "You both need to understand the full extent of what is happening." I nodded, trying to steady myself. It was clear now that the Vampire King was not just fighting for power. He was fighting for survival. For all of us. The girl beside him, his daughter, looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "What do we do now, Father?" she asked, her voice small but filled with determination. The Vampire King hesitated for a moment before responding. "Now we rebuild," he said. "We regroup, gather our allies, and prepare for what is coming." He looked at me then, his eyes hardening with the weight of his responsibility. "You're part of this now. You have a role to play, whether you realize it or not." His words hit me harder than I expected. I had known from the moment I called him for help that my life would never be the same, but I hadn't expected to be pulled so deeply into his world. The world of vampires, of ancient power, of enemies waiting in the shadows. The Vampire King's eyes softened for a moment, and he placed a hand gently on his daughter's shoulder. "And you," he said, his voice quieter now, "you have a future to fight for. Your safety is my top priority." The girl smiled up at him, her eyes shining with trust. She had come a long way from the terrified child who had first called out for help, but the look in her eyes also carried the weight of knowing that danger was never far away. The Vampire King turned to me again. "We have a long road ahead," he said. There will be many more battles to fight, and we cannot afford to lose anyone. Not now. I swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. We weren't just fighting for survival anymore. We were fighting for the future, for a chance at a life that wasn't ruled by fear. What do you need from me? I asked, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. The Vampire King gave me a sharp, appraising look. I need you to trust me, he said simply. And I need you to be prepared for what's coming. You've already proven yourself tonight. But the real test is just beginning. His words struck a chord deep within me. I had always been a survivor, always scraped by with just enough to make it through another day. But this was something completely different. This was a battle for everything we held dear. What's the plan? I asked, finding my voice again. The Vampire King turned to face the room, his gaze hardening. First, we regroup. We need to find out who is behind this, and why they want to destroy everything we've built. We can't afford to leave any stone unturned. He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. And then, we fight. There was no hesitation in his voice. It was the voice of someone who had seen war, who knew what it meant to lose and to win. I felt a surge of determination, a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in a long time. I had a role to play in this fight, and I wasn't going to back down. The Vampire King turned back to his daughter, his eyes softening once more. And you, he said, his voice filled with love and pride. You'll be safe. I won't let anything happen to you. She smiled up at him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. It was a small thing, but in that moment, it felt like everything. As we moved to prepare for the battles ahead, I knew that whatever happened next, we wouldn't face it alone. The Vampire King had a plan, and we would follow it together. With his strength, and with the strength of those who stood by him, we would fight for our future, no matter what it took. I had no time to process the weight of everything that had happened. The Vampire King's words echoed in my mind, his cold, commanding tone telling me that the real fight was just beginning. I stood by, watching as he made preparations, organizing his forces, and speaking with his allies. It was clear that the battle ahead was going to test us all in ways we couldn't even predict. The girl, his daughter, clung to him tightly. Despite the fear in her eyes, there was a quiet strength in the way she stood by her father, trusting him completely. I wondered if I could ever feel that kind of unwavering trust. The Vampire King didn't seem to rest for a moment, his mind always racing ahead, calculating the next move. He was relentless. There was no room for hesitation. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally turned to face me. His expression softened for just a moment, as though he was taking a brief moment to check on me, to make sure I was still with him. Stay close, he said, his voice steady. Things are about to get worse, and we'll need to move fast. I nodded, my heart hammering in my chest. The weight of his words settled in. Worse? I had no idea what was coming, but I knew I didn't want to find out alone. The room we were in, though grand and regal, now felt like a fortress on the brink of a siege. The air was thick with tension, the constant sound of people moving in and out, preparing for what they knew was inevitable. No one spoke much, but I could feel the urgency in every action. The Vampire King's power was palpable, like a storm about to break. But with power came enemies. And from the looks on the faces of the few gathered here, they all knew that the Vampire King had made a formidable enemy. They didn't just want to defeat him. They wanted to erase him entirely. The king's daughter, though young, had begun to understand the gravity of the situation. She asked no questions, but her eyes followed her father, watching his every move as if memorizing his strength. There was something beautiful about the way she trusted him, something that reminded me of a time before I had ever known real fear. It's not just them anymore, the Vampire King muttered as he paced. There are more factions involved, more players in this game than I'd like to admit. The shadows in the room seemed to darken as the weight of his words settled on us. It wasn't just one enemy anymore. It was an entire network of them. And the worst part? We didn't know who we could trust. As we continued to prepare, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew. This world of vampires, power, and hidden wars, it was far more dangerous and complicated than I could have imagined. The king turned to me again. His face, though still hard and resolute, held a flicker of something like concern. You've already made your choice, he said quietly. But once we go in, there's no turning back. Are you ready for that? I took a deep breath. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I didn't have a choice. I nodded, the weight of my decision settling deep in my chest. The Vampire King looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once, as if affirming that I wasn't just another pawn in his game. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room with the precision of a strategist. "Get the council together," he commanded, his voice firm. "We need to know everything about our enemies and where they're coming from. No more secrets." There was a flurry of activity as his orders were passed out. I could see the fear in the eyes of some, but also something else, determination. We weren't just going to sit and wait for the storm to come to us. We were going to fight. The Vampire King turned back to me. "Stay sharp," he said, his voice lowering to a dangerous tone. "This is where the real fight begins." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but there was no going back now. I followed him as we moved toward the next room, the doors opening with a heavy groan. The people in the room stopped talking as soon as we entered. Their eyes shifted toward us, and for a moment, the air was thick with uncertainty. The king addressed them, his voice cool and controlled. "This is the beginning of the end," he said, his gaze sweeping over the gathered faces. "We fight now, or we fall. There are no other options." The room went silent as everyone processed his words. I could feel the weight of it, the gravity of the situation. No one here had a choice anymore. We were all in this together, whether we were ready or not. The king's daughter stepped forward, her small voice breaking the silence. "We will fight," she said firmly. The strength in her words took me by surprise. This little girl, who had once been so fragile, was now standing alongside her father with unwavering confidence. It was clear that the future of this world was going to be shaped by people like her. People who fought, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The Vampire King looked down at his daughter, his eyes softening with something akin to pride. "We will," he agreed quietly. "We will fight together." The room seemed to hold its breath as we prepared for what came next. The world outside was waiting, and the storm was coming. But no matter what happened, I knew one thing for sure. We wouldn't face it alone. I could feel the tension in the air as we gathered in the war room, a space that once would have been filled with plans of prosperity, now tainted with the looming threat of war. The Vampire King stood at the center, his eyes scanning over the map spread across the table. He wasn't just planning for a fight anymore. This was something deeper, more personal. This was survival. I stood beside him, watching as the council members, vampires of old blood and power, made their way into the room. The heaviness of their presence was unmistakable. These were creatures who had lived for centuries, and each one carried the weight of their history like a cloak. They were not here just to give advice. They were here to decide the fate of us all. "We cannot afford any more delays," the Vampire King said, his voice steady but edged with urgency. He turned to the first of his council members, a tall figure with eyes like glass, shimmering with ancient knowledge. "You've heard of the attack on our borders?" The council member nodded solemnly, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns carved into the stone of the table. "We have seen the signs," he said, his voice low, like the rumbling of thunder in the distance. "There is a movement, something we have not felt in centuries." Another council member, a woman with fiery red hair and eyes that glinted with a fierce intelligence, spoke next. "The humans have been gathering forces. They are more organized now. They've allied themselves with rogue vampires, those who wish to see your reign end." The Vampire King's expression hardened at this. His gaze flicked toward his daughter, who stood quietly by his side. She had become a symbol of his resolve, a silent reminder of why he fought. "And the ones behind all this?" he asked. "Who pulls the strings?" The woman with red hair looked at him with a mix of fear and respect. "We don't know for sure, but the signs point to the Shadow Court. They've been quiet for centuries, but their influence is far-reaching." The Vampire King's eyes narrowed. The Shadow Court was an ancient faction of vampires that had long been thought extinct, wiped out during a brutal war centuries ago. Their return was nothing short of catastrophic. "We cannot let them gain more ground," he said, his voice thick with resolve. "We need to strike now, before they can gather more power." The room was silent as the weight of his words sank in. I could feel the tension building, a pressure in the air that seemed to grow with every passing second. But then, the Vampire King's daughter, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Father," she said, her voice small but filled with determination. I want to fight too. I'm not going to hide. There was a moment of stunned silence. The council members, who had been silent until now, exchanged wary glances. The Vampire King turned to his daughter, his face a mixture of pride and worry. You're too young, he said softly. This fight is not one for a child. She shook her head. I'm not a child anymore. I've seen what they're capable of, and I won't stand by while you fight alone. Her words were simple, but they struck deep. The Vampire King stared at her for a long time, the weight of his responsibility clearly weighing on him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. Very well, he said, but you will stay close to me. This battle will be dangerous, and I will not risk losing you. The girl smiled softly, her eyes gleaming with newfound strength. I will fight by your side, father. As the council continued to discuss their strategy, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping over me. There was so much at stake, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead was overwhelming. The Vampire King's world was one of power, but it was also a world fraught with danger, betrayal, and loss. And yet, as I stood there, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of belonging. We were all in this together, bound by blood, by fate, and by the choice to stand and fight. The discussion turned to logistics, where to place forces, what resources were needed, and how to secure their most vulnerable points. I listened, my mind racing with possibilities, but my heart was heavy. No plan could prepare us for what was coming. And yet, there was something in the Vampire King's presence, in the way he commanded the room, that gave me a flicker of hope. Perhaps, with him leading us, we stood a chance. The council session dragged on into the night, but the plan was finally set. We would move quickly, with the first strike planned for the next evening. The Vampire King dismissed the council with a single motion, his focus already shifting to the preparations that needed to be made. This isn't just a fight for power, he said, his voice carrying to everyone in the room. This is a fight for our future. As I left the room with the Vampire King and his daughter, I couldn't shake the feeling that the battle we were about to face would define everything. The stakes were higher than ever. And in this world of vampires, nothing was ever as it seemed. I woke up to the sounds of hurried footsteps and whispered voices, the tension in the air palpable. The plan to strike was set in motion, and with it, a sense of urgency had taken over every corner of the Vampire King's stronghold. As I stood in the dim light of the chamber, I could feel the weight of the night bearing down on us. The first wave of the attack would come at dusk, but until then, every moment counted. The Vampire King, ever composed, was already overseeing the final preparations. His daughter, standing by his side, had a look of quiet determination, a stark contrast to the fragile child she had once been. I had seen the change in her, how her fear had transformed into a fierce resolve to fight for the future of her world. It was clear now that the true battle wasn't just against external forces. It was about the strength of the bonds they had forged, the trust in one another that would see them through this war. I joined the Vampire King as he moved through the war room, his steps purposeful. His eyes never strayed from the maps and plans laid out before him, but his voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of authority. This will not be an easy fight, he said to the room, his tone firm but resolute. We face an enemy that has been building its forces in secret for decades. They know our strengths, and they will exploit our weaknesses. But we will not falter. We will strike first, and we will strike hard. His gaze swept over the council members who stood at attention, each of them eager to fulfill their role in the coming battle. The Vampire King's presence alone commanded their respect, and I could feel their loyalty to him in every glance exchanged. The room was heavy with the expectation of what was to come, yet there was also a sense of unity. These were not just warriors. They were family, bound together by an unspoken promise to protect what mattered most. His daughter, standing beside him, caught my eye. She gave me a small nod, as if silently urging me to trust in what lay ahead. I could see the same fierce strength in her that I had seen in her father. There was no turning back now. The time had come. As the hours ticked away, the preparations continued. Weapons were sharpened, armor was donned, and the air seemed to thrum with the energy of something far larger than ourselves. The Vampire King moved with precision, coordinating everything with the ease of someone who had seen war countless times. But even he knew that this time, it was different. The stakes were higher. The enemies were more insidious. And the fate of their world rested on their shoulders. "We move out at dusk," the Vampire King said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Be ready." The council members dispersed, each of them heading off to their assigned stations. The girl stayed close to her father, her eyes steady, unwavering. She had made her decision. She was no longer a child. She was a warrior, just like her father. As I prepared myself, the enormity of what was about to happen settled over me like a dark cloud. I had entered this world with nothing but hope and a desperate need to survive. But now, I was fighting for something bigger. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the Vampire King, his daughter, and the future of everything they held dear. The air grew colder as the sun began to set. The first wave of the battle was upon us. The Vampire King's forces were ready, their movements swift and precise. The time for hesitation was over. We would meet our enemies head-on, and there would be no retreat. The girl, standing by her father's side, was ready. I was ready. The first wave of darkness descended upon us as the battle began. The night sky was filled with the sounds of war, clashing metal, the shrieks of creatures caught in the frenzy, and the deep, guttural roars of enemies driven by a relentless desire for power. The Vampire King was a force to be reckoned with, his presence cutting through the chaos like a blade. He fought with the precision of a master, his movements sharp and calculated. But there was something more in his eyes, something that spoke of centuries of loss, of battles fought not just with strength, but with sacrifice. As the battle raged on, I found myself fighting not just for survival, but for a future that seemed more fragile with every passing moment. And then, amidst the chaos, I saw her. The girl, his daughter, was fighting with a determination that was beyond her years. She was fierce, moving with a confidence that only someone who had truly embraced their destiny could possess. I couldn't help but watch her in awe as she fought alongside her father, a force of nature in her own right. The battle seemed to stretch on forever, each clash more brutal than the last. But through it all, the Vampire King and his daughter stood strong, their bond unbroken. And in that moment, I knew we had a chance. We had a chance to survive. Together, I could hear the clash of steel against steel, the sounds of battle ringing out through the air. The first wave had hit hard, but we weren't backing down. The Vampire King fought with a brutal grace, his movements sharp, fluid, a master of his craft. His daughter, no longer the frightened child I had met, stood beside him, her face set in determination. She fought with a fierceness that matched her father's, her every move a testament to the strength she had inherited from him. The enemy was everywhere, their numbers seeming endless as they surged forward. I could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on us, the stakes higher than ever. The Vampire King had made it clear, this fight wasn't just about survival. It was about protecting everything they had fought for, everything they had lost, and everything they hoped to rebuild. The war raged on for what felt like hours. Our enemies, creatures and rogue vampires alike, were relentless, pushing us to our limits. But we weren't going to back down. We couldn't. The Vampire King's voice echoed through the chaos as he barked orders to his forces, his commanding presence unshaken by the fury of the battle. His eyes were a cold fire, burning with a resolve that seemed unbreakable. But even the strongest of leaders could be tested by such a war. As I fought alongside him, my own fear slowly melted away, replaced by a grim determination. This was the world we had stepped into, a world where power wasn't just claimed, it was fought for, clawed at, and bled for. And in this moment, it was clear that the Vampire King would do whatever it took to keep his family safe. His daughter was a fierce warrior, her youthful face set in a mask of concentration. She moved through the battle with the skill of someone who had trained for years, her every step calculated, her strikes precise. I couldn't help but marvel at her strength, at the way she carried herself, like someone who knew exactly what she was fighting for. As the fight pressed on, I found myself catching glimpses of her, her movements like lightning, as she darted in and out of the fray, her blade striking down enemies with deadly accuracy. It was impossible not to be inspired by her. The Vampire King was everywhere, cutting through the enemy lines with brutal efficiency. His enemies were strong, but they had underestimated him. He was not just a ruler. He was a warrior, born of ancient blood, and he was a force to be reckoned with. The battle had taken its toll on all of us, but we were not backing down. We could see the cracks forming in the enemy's ranks, their resolve beginning to waver. The Vampire King's forces were strong, but it was the bond between them, the trust they placed in their leader, that made them unstoppable. I could see the shift. The enemy's numbers were thinning, their morale breaking as the Vampire King's forces pressed forward, relentless in their pursuit. It was in that moment, as we stood at the edge of the battle, that I realized something. This war wasn't just about power. It wasn't just about a throne or a kingdom. It was about legacy, about protecting the people we loved, the lives we had built. The Vampire King had fought for centuries, but this was his legacy. This was the future of his bloodline, his daughter, the life he had fought to build. And for the first time, I understood. This was his fight, and we would fight it together. The battle raged on, but the turning point was close. The Vampire King's forces were gaining ground, his enemies retreating, their ranks breaking under the pressure of his unyielding force. But the battle was far from over. The enemy had more hidden forces, more tricks up their sleeves. The Vampire King knew this, and he prepared for whatever came next. As the dust began to settle, he stood tall amidst the wreckage of the battle, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The fight wasn't over, but we had won this round. And in that victory, I saw something shift in him. A flicker of hope, a glimmer of what could be. His daughter stood beside him, her face smeared with dirt, but her eyes alight with pride. She had fought beside him, and they had won together. It was a moment of victory, but also of realization. The Vampire King had built his empire, his strength, his legacy. But in this moment, he had something more, something he had fought for all along. His family, his future. And with that, he turned to me, his eyes fierce with determination. "This is only the beginning," he said. "We have much more to do, but we will do it together." And with that, the battle was far from over. But we had already won. The first victory. And we would keep fighting, for each other, for the future, and for the legacy that was ours to protect. I could feel the weight of the battlefield still hanging in the air as the last of the enemy forces retreated into the shadows, their numbers scattered and broken. But as the dust settled, a new kind of tension emerged, one that spoke of not just a victory, but the uncertainty of what would come next. The Vampire King, standing tall amidst the wreckage, surveyed the battlefield with a cool, calculating gaze. His posture was impeccable, his presence undeniable. But even he knew that this victory was only the beginning. His daughter, standing by his side, had a look of fierce determination on her face. She had fought with him, bled with him, and now stood as his equal. I could see the bond between them, stronger than ever, forged in the heat of battle. "We've won this round," the Vampire King said, his voice low and commanding. "But there are still forces out there that want to tear everything we've built down. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." His words rang in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. As the battlefield quieted, the forces that had once stood against us were now retreating into the dark corners of the world. But there were still pieces of the puzzle left to solve. Who was behind all this? Who had orchestrated the attack, and why? The Vampire King knew that this wasn't just about the physical battle. This was about power, control, and more than that, it was about survival. His empire, his legacy, everything he had fought for, was now at risk. The girl, his daughter, turned to him, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "What do we do now, father?" she asked. Her words were simple, but they held so much weight. It was clear that she was no longer just a child. She was a warrior, ready to face whatever came next, side by side with her father. The Vampire King's gaze softened, just for a moment, before hardening again. "We regroup," he said firmly. "We find out who our true enemies are, and we make sure they never threaten us again. We've only just begun to uncover the truth." His voice was filled with a quiet resolve. There would be no retreat, no surrender. The stakes were higher now. I stood at the edge of the room, taking it all in. The intensity in the air was palpable, but there was something else too, a sense of unity. Despite the chaos and destruction of the battle, we had come through it together. And that was what mattered. The Vampire King turned to me then, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with something deeper, appreciation. "You've proven yourself tonight," he said. "But this fight is far from over. You will need to be ready. We will all need to be ready." I nodded, the weight of his words settling in. I had chosen this path. There was no turning back now. The girl stepped forward, her eyes shining with determination. "I'm ready," she said, her voice unwavering. "I will fight until the very end. We will protect this world, together." Her words were a promise to herself, to her father, and to the world they were fighting to protect. The Vampire King placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze softening. "And I will protect you," he said quietly. "But remember, this fight is not just about us. It's about everyone who believes in what we stand for. We cannot let the darkness win." As he spoke, the gravity of the situation became even clearer. This wasn't just about us. This was about the future. The future of the vampires, of the world that had been built in the shadows, and of the legacy that they would leave behind. The time for hesitation was over. We had won this battle, but the war was far from finished. And as we stood together in that moment, I realized that no matter what happened next, we would face it head on. We would fight together, and we would not be broken. The enemy had learned that the Vampire King was not easily defeated. And now, we were stronger than ever. As the night stretched on, the Vampire King gave his orders, the plan already forming in his mind. We would track down the remaining enemies, those who had stayed hidden, and root them out before they could strike again. But the road ahead was uncertain. The world we lived in was full of shadows, of enemies who waited for their moment to strike. But the Vampire King was prepared. He would not let anyone take what he had built. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice steady as ever. "But we are ready. We will fight with everything we have." I stood beside him, ready to face whatever came next. We had already proven our strength, our resolve. And together, we would make sure that the darkness would never again have the power to consume us. I stood at the edge of the battlefield, the sounds of retreating enemies slowly fading into the distance. The chaos of the past hours had given way to a grim silence. The Vampire King, his eyes steely and unyielding, surveyed the remnants of the fight with an intensity that seemed to see through the very walls around us. Despite the victory, there was no celebration, no relief. There was only preparation for the next fight. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We've won this skirmish," he said, his voice low but filled with a quiet strength. "But this was just one battle. The war is far from over. We still don't know who is really behind this. We need answers, and we need them quickly." His daughter stood beside him, still as fierce as she had been in the heat of the battle. But now there was something new in her gaze, a quiet determination that matched her father's. The fight was not just about their survival anymore. It was about securing a future for the world they had built. "What's the next move?" I asked, my voice steady despite the uncertainty still clawing at my chest. The Vampire King didn't hesitate. "We'll regroup, and then we'll track down the remaining factions. We've learned enough to know that this attack was no coincidence. It's part of something much larger, and we need to find out exactly who's orchestrating it." His words carried a weight I couldn't ignore. There was something behind this attack, something hidden in the shadows, and the Vampire King knew it. "We cannot afford to waste time," he continued. "There will be no more hesitation. Our enemies are getting bolder, and they will stop at nothing to see us fall." His daughter nodded beside him, her gaze unwavering. She was not afraid. She had faced the enemy head-on, stood beside her father through the darkest moments, and emerged stronger for it. It was clear now that she was no longer just the child they had once protected. She was a warrior, just like her father. And together, they would stop at nothing to protect the legacy they had built. I could feel the fire in their resolve, and it burned in me too. Whatever happened next, I knew I couldn't walk away. The Vampire King had brought me into this world, and now, I was a part of it. "We will move out at dawn," the Vampire King said, his voice cutting through the air. "Prepare yourselves. This will be our most dangerous mission yet." As he spoke, I could feel the tension growing. The weight of his words settled over me. This was no longer just a fight for survival. This was a fight for everything. For the future, for the world, and for the very legacy of the Vampire King and his family. The girl, standing resolute by her father's side, turned to me. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice quiet but strong. I met her gaze, the determination in her eyes mirroring her father's. "I'm ready," I said, feeling the weight of her trust settle in my chest. We weren't just fighting for power anymore. We were fighting for a future that had to be protected. The Vampire King turned to face the council members who had gathered around, awaiting his orders. "This mission will be crucial," he said. "We need to find the source of this rebellion and eliminate it before it grows beyond our control. We cannot allow our enemies to divide us any further." The council members nodded in agreement, their faces stern, filled with the same determination I had seen in the king and his daughter. These weren't just servants. They were warriors, each one prepared to fight and die for the future they all believed in. As the planning continued, I found myself deep in thought. The battle had shown us just how high the stakes were. The enemies we faced were ruthless, and they had no intention of letting us rebuild what we had fought so hard to protect. But I had seen the strength of the Vampire King's forces. I had seen the unity between him and his daughter, and I knew that this fight was far from over. In the face of overwhelming odds, there was one thing that would always set them apart. Together, they were unstoppable. I wasn't sure what the next step would be, but I knew one thing for certain. I would stand by their side. We would fight together, and we would not stop until we had reclaimed our future. The night stretched on, and as we prepared for what was to come, I could feel the calm before the storm. We had no illusions about the challenges ahead, but in that moment, there was a quiet strength that filled the room. Whatever came next, we were ready. The enemy had no idea what they were up against. I could feel the tension in the air as the night began to settle. The Vampire King stood at the edge of the war room, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes locked on the map spread before him. The hum of activity around him was the only sound that broke the stillness. His forces were ready, the first wave of their attack set to begin at dawn. We had no time to waste. Every decision, every move would matter. "We've learned enough," the Vampire King said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Tomorrow, we move. We'll strike where they least expect it. This fight is about more than just us. It's about the future of everything we've built." His daughter, standing at his side, nodded. Her resolve was unmistakable. She was no longer the girl who had hidden in the shadows. She had embraced her role as his heir, and she was ready to lead. The bond between them was evident, unspoken but undeniable. They were a force, bound by blood, and they would fight to protect that bloodline. I stood behind them, still processing the enormity of what lay ahead. The world I had entered was not a simple one. There were no easy answers, no simple victories. Every step was fraught with danger. But there was also something else. The Vampire King was not just a ruler. He was a survivor. He had seen empires fall, watched as centuries of his kind had been lost in wars, betrayals, and secrets. But through it all, he had endured. And now, standing beside him, I realized that this fight was not just for the vampires. It was for everyone. The fate of all their futures rested on what we would do next. "Do you understand what's at stake?" the Vampire King asked, his eyes narrowing as he turned to me. His gaze was sharp, testing. "This isn't just a battle. This is the beginning of a new order. If we fail, everything we've fought for will be destroyed. We're not just fighting for survival. We're fighting to reshape the world." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. There was no turning back. We had come too far. The girl, his daughter, looked at me, her eyes unwavering. "We're counting on you," she said quietly, but there was strength in her words. She had no doubts, no hesitations. Her faith in her father, and in me, was absolute. I couldn't let her down. I couldn't let any of them down. The next day arrived quickly, the light of dawn breaking through the darkened skies as we prepared to move out. The Vampire King's forces were already in motion, their steps silent and swift, moving like shadows, ready to strike. We moved under the cover of night, the city ahead of us brimming with tension. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on us as we neared our target. The battle ahead was going to be fierce. We had no illusions about the enemy. They would be prepared. They would fight back with everything they had. But we were ready. As we approached the enemy's stronghold, the Vampire King's presence was overwhelming. He led us without hesitation, his focus unwavering. He had lived for centuries, seen countless battles, but there was something different this time. This was personal. The darkness that had once threatened to consume his world was now within his reach, and he was determined to make sure it never had the chance to grow. His daughter, ever by his side, looked at him with trust and loyalty. She was ready for whatever came next. "Stay close," the Vampire King instructed, his voice calm but firm. We strike at dawn. We cannot afford to lose any ground. The forces around us moved with precision, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. The training, the discipline, the unity, all of it came together in that moment. We were ready. The first wave of the battle began with a fury, the sounds of steel meeting steel, the clash of the forces ringing in the air. The Vampire King's forces surged forward, cutting through the enemy with ruthless efficiency. The girl fought beside him, every strike calculated and precise. She was not just fighting for herself or for her father. She was fighting for a future that would allow her to live without fear. As the battle raged on, I found myself caught up in it. I fought with everything I had, my body moving on instinct, the adrenaline driving me forward. But I knew, deep down, that this fight was bigger than any of us. The enemy fought back fiercely, their numbers overwhelming. But the Vampire King's forces were relentless, pushing forward inch by inch. As the sun began to rise, casting its first light on the battlefield, the momentum began to shift. The enemy faltered, their strength waning as we pressed on. Victory was within reach. But just as we thought the end was in sight, a new force appeared, stronger, darker, more menacing than anything we had encountered before. The battle was far from over. The real fight was just beginning. The new enemy emerged from the shadows, darker and more menacing than anything we had expected. Their presence was overwhelming, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The battle we had fought so far had only been the opening act. This was the true test. The Vampire King, standing tall and resolute, quickly assessed the new threat. His eyes burned with determination, but there was also something else there, a flicker of something old, something from a time long past. His daughter, standing beside him, drew her weapon, her gaze unwavering. She had grown in ways no one had expected, and I could see it now. She wasn't just following her father. She was his equal in every sense. Together, they had faced down countless enemies. But this was different. The forces that had gathered against us now weren't just attacking with physical might. They were wielding something darker, something more insidious. The air felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath us was holding its breath. The Vampire King took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the enemy's advancing lines. "This ends now," he said, his voice cold and final. "We are not just fighting for our survival anymore. We are fighting for the future of everything we've built." His daughter nodded, her expression filled with the same fire that had fueled their every battle. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice steady. The enemy surged forward, but the Vampire King's forces were ready. The air crackled with energy as the battle raged once more. Steel clashed with steel, and the ground beneath our feet shook with the force of the fighting. Every strike, every movement felt like the world was on the verge of breaking. I fought beside them, the adrenaline pushing me forward, but there was something more now. This wasn't just about survival. This was about protecting the future, about standing together against an enemy that would stop at nothing to destroy us. As the fight intensified, I could see the Vampire King and his daughter at the heart of it, moving in perfect synchronization, a deadly dance of power and precision. Each strike they delivered sent shockwaves through the enemy's lines, but still, they pressed on, unyielding. The enemy was relentless, but we were stronger. With every battle, we grew more united, more determined. It was clear now that this wasn't just a fight for power, it was a fight for the very soul of the world we had created. And no matter the cost, we would not let it fall. As the battle continued, the Vampire King's forces began to turn the tide. The enemy's ranks began to fracture, their attacks slowing as their will to fight faltered. The darkness they had relied on was no match for the strength and unity we had forged. But just when it seemed like victory was within our grasp, a final wave of dark energy surged forward, crashing against us with the force of a tidal wave. The ground beneath our feet split, and for a moment, everything seemed to fall into chaos. The Vampire King and his daughter stood firm, their power radiating in every direction as they fought to hold the line. I watched as they fought, their bond undeniable, their strength unmatched. The energy around us was overwhelming, but they were unyielding. "Hold the line," the Vampire King shouted, his voice a command that cut through the chaos. His daughter moved beside him, her every movement a mirror of his, working in perfect harmony. The battle raged on, but I could feel it now, the shift in the air. We were winning. Slowly, steadily, the tide was turning. The enemy's forces were breaking, their once united front now crumbling under the weight of our determination. The Vampire King's forces surged forward, pushing them back, step by step. As the final blow was struck, the battlefield fell silent. The enemy forces, once so formidable, lay defeated. The air around us was still, but there was no time to rest. The Vampire King, standing at the center of it all, turned to his daughter. She looked up at him, her expression filled with pride and gratitude. "We did it," she said, her voice quiet but full of emotion. "Yes," the Vampire King replied, his voice steady but filled with a depth of feeling that only a father could understand. "We did it together." I stood there, watching them. Their victory was hard-earned, but it was theirs. They had fought for everything, against impossible odds, against forces beyond their control, and they had prevailed. And in that moment, I understood what this battle had truly been about. It wasn't just about the fight. It was about the people we fought for, the ones we loved, the future we wanted to protect. The Vampire King and his daughter had faced down darkness, but they had not done so alone. We were with them, standing together. And as the sun began to rise, casting its first light on the battlefield, I knew that the future was still ours to shape. The darkness may have threatened to consume us, but in the end, we had fought back. And together, we had won. In this captivating vampire story, we follow the journey of a powerful vampire king and his daughter as they fight to protect their empire from dark forces seeking to destroy it. With intense battles, unwavering loyalty, and a legacy at stake, this story is filled with thrilling moments and unexpected twists. The Vampire King leads his forces in a relentless battle, facing an enemy that is as ruthless as they are determined to bring his world to an end. His daughter, once a frightened child, has now become his fiercest ally, ready to fight alongside him to ensure the survival of everything they've built. As the story unfolds, we see their bond strengthen, proving that family and unity are the ultimate weapons against the darkness. In true vampire stories fashion, the fight is not just for survival, but for the future of their world. With each battle, the stakes grow higher, and the enemies become more dangerous, forcing the Vampire King and his daughter to dig deeper into their powers. But despite the odds stacked against them, they press on, knowing that their strength lies in their unbreakable bond. As the story reaches its climax, it's clear that these vampire stories are not just about power, but about love, sacrifice, and the hope for a better future. With dark enemies lurking at every turn, the Vampire King and his daughter will stop at nothing to protect their legacy and the future of their kind. This is not just another vampire story. It's an epic tale of survival, family, and the relentless fight against the forces of darkness that threaten everything they hold dear. In the end, the Vampire King and his daughter emerge victorious, not just because of their strength, but because they fought for each other, for their people, and for the future of all vampire stories to come.